Hey there, good people in crypto land. I'm Matt Leising. This is my podcast, Decent People. Welcome back to the conversation. Today, I spoke with Scott Lawin, who is the CEO of Candy Digital, which is an NFT platform that has partnerships with some really heavy hitters like Major League Baseball, Netflix, Getty Images, the WWE, and a lot of others. They also just partnered with a firm that has Warner Brothers and Marvel, and so they've got a lot of entertainment aspects to their business that they are now getting access to. Before doing that, Scott had a long and distinguished career on Wall Street. He was at Goldman Sachs in the early 90s. Then he went to Fortress, which is a huge investment management fund. He was there during the financial crisis, and we talked about that, of course, because I can't get enough financial crisis stories. He was also at More Capital, which is a huge alternative investment advisor. Before all that, he went to MIT and got an architecture degree. He has a lifelong association and affinity for the arts. He also was thinking about becoming a nuclear physicist before kind of changing his mind and moving more towards architecture and then back into finance. We talked about all of that and about what they're doing at Candy Digital, where they are working on the Palm Network, and they are in the midst of the Major League Baseball season, and they have collectible individual cards and team cards, and they're doing things like with Major League Baseball that sanctions moments in baseball history that you might want to own as an NFT connected to a blockchain. So Scott's a really smart guy. I love it when I see these folks from Wall Street and traditional finance jumping into Web3. I think the whole space is better for it. So with all that being said, let's get to the conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks. Hey, Scott, how you doing? Thanks so much for being here today.
I'm great, Matt. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to talking to you because you've got such a fascinating background at some of the heaviest hitters as they come in finance. And then I love it when those sorts of folks make the leap into Web3. But I thought, first of all, I was also impressed with your long history with arts patronage and involvement in the art community. And it struck me as I was looking over your resume and stuff. So you're the CEO of Candy Digital, which is a very big NFT platform. You guys have partnerships with Major League Baseball and Netflix and NASCAR, and we're going to get into all that. But it struck me that I wondered if you, coming into the NFT world, came in as an art collector or somebody who had loved art previously in their life and you still do. Was that something, and maybe that's obvious to you, but I just wondered if you had thought about it like that, and that's maybe why the NFT space appealed to you.
Yeah, no, it's actually a really interesting insight. It is part of what brought me into the space. And as you rightly noted, I've been a fan of the arts, a patron of the arts, and inspired by the arts for pretty much my whole life. I actually studied architecture as an undergrad before moving into finance. Art and design has always been a hobby and a passion, not necessarily a career. And prior to starting Candy in 2020, one of the reasons that we started the company and co-founded it was learning more about NFTs, post-crypto kitties, starting to think about what does it mean to own a digital asset, whether that's a JPEG image or a video file or some other sort of creative piece of content, but have unique ownership on chain. And the idea that artists and creators and IP owners can actually benefit not just in the primary sale, but in ongoing royalties over time was a really powerful concept for me. In 2019, I actually curated the largest global street art exhibition in the world and spent a lot of time working with artists. And that was very specific to a particular project and a nonprofit.
That was the Red campaign, right?
Yeah, exactly. Paint Red, Save Lives.
Yeah.
But spend a lot of time with those artists just talking about their own work and their own careers. And it just never seemed fair to me that a young artist might sell a painting for $10,000 and then X number of years go by and that painting might sell for $1 million and the artist never benefited along the way. And that idea of having that connectivity and that connection back to the work and support of artists was actually one of the core things that got me excited about NFTs in particular.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. I thought that was an amazing advancement for artists, just like you mentioned. Then it was disappointing to learn maybe a year ago or so that a lot of those royalty payments from selling on pieces weren't actually happening. And I didn't know this, but I learned that, you've got the smart contracts that are controlling the NFT itself, and then you've got a smart contract that's controlling like OpenSea or another marketplace. And a lot of times those aren't synced. So the royalty payment feature doesn't get implemented. Am I stating that correctly? And what are you guys doing about that at Candy?
Yeah, no, it's a shame because I think at the core of this community are creators. And certainly some of the key activity has been around artist projects that have driven a tremendous amount of interest in onboarding, et cetera. The industry, frankly, has done an own goal on itself by not honoring those royalties. And OpenSea, obviously, which became the biggest marketplace in the space, was a defender of royalties. They got vampire attacked by Blur and LooksRare and others, where honoring royalties wasn't part of that exchange plan as a way to just attract volume. And I'm sure you saw recently, just in the last week or so, OpenSea now put some information out suggesting that they may step away from that as well. And so it's a shame because I think at the core of what the community is, at the core of the sort of benefit for creators is this idea of having an ongoing stake in the work that they're creating. The way that we are addressing it currently at Candy, a larger conversation about how we've built our platform, is that in many ways, because of issues around how the broader industry works and how the tech is or isn't being supported, we're a little bit more of a Web 2.5 company, I would say, and so our assets live in our platform, and so when those assets trade, royalties get collected on our platform and then go back to the IP owners or the artists, et cetera. We're really interested in moving towards opening our platform and our assets up to much more decentralization, but we want to do that in a way that actually protects the creators and protects the IP owners. And so I haven't figured exactly the silver bullet on that, but as some of the new contract standards are coming out there are ways and tools that are being developed that'll give us a better opportunity to do that.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad to hear that you guys are thinking about it and trying to move in that direction. And it's interesting you say Web 2.5 because I noticed you're letting folks pay for, say, MLB, Major League Baseball collector pack with credit cards, and then you said it lives in your ecosystem. Is that an effort to make this easier for folks so they don't have to set up a wallet and they don't have to have crypto, or you're like baby steps here?
Yeah, that was a big part of the thesis. So back in 2020, and this goes back to my initial interest in crypto and how I started to get involved back in 2016 and 2017, was very much through the lens of finance and thinking about currencies, thinking about payment processing, thinking about sort of disintermediation of some of the financial infrastructure, and then moving contracts into smart contracts. We started really to see institutional adoption in the crypto markets as something that felt like it was going to inevitably continue. Big asset managers, hedge funds, wealthy individuals starting to own crypto, large institutional players starting to build out and test infrastructure. And so our question was really around what were the things that were going to bring everyday people into the space, understanding that the process of setting up a wallet, writing your seed phrase down or hiding it, the idea that you could lose millions of dollars potentially of stored value if your seed phrase was compromised or lost, wasn't one that had a great UX, right? And that was going to be ready for prime time with most people. And so what we thought about was what were the things that got people excited about products, experience, et cetera. And it's content in many ways, right? It's whether it's sports, whether it's entertainment, whether it's culture, it's things that people are passionate about that lead them to experiment and find new ways to engage in that information or those stories. And so that was ultimately how we ended up leaning into sports and entertainment for Candy. And we wanted to do it in a way that was true to the technology, the idea of owning a tokenized piece of content that lived on chain and was verifiable and authenticated and identifiable, but do it in a really simple, kind of abstracted e-commerce way. And with your credit card, with an email, somebody who doesn't know what an NFT is, hasn't experimented in crypto, can now own a digital asset, start to understand what the benefits of owning, let's say, a digital trading card might be versus owning a physical trading card, and get educated and enter the space. And so that's really been Candy's thesis along the way, is work with these big sports entertainment and culture properties, introduce customers, very many for the first time, into the space, and start to build that momentum going forward.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I would say I don't see much improvement on the user experience here yet. Like, things are still very much clunky and difficult. And if, like you said, if you lose your seed phrase or you lose your private key or you get it stolen, that's tough shit. Do you see any light at the end of that tunnel?
I think that there are some products and companies out there that are trying to address that user experience upfront. They want to stay true to crypto roots. They want to make sure that the functionality, the Web3 functionality is there, that not your keys, not your content, ultimately is what everything goes back to. But we're not totally there yet, right? We're not there yet at a way that's fully scalable. I think what we've seen in the last year or so, people aren't talking about NFTs as much, right? They talk about digital collectibles. They talk about loyalty and rewards, and just even changing the nomenclature, changing the way that it's presented to consumers, I think is a step in the right direction. And when we started Candy, frankly, we actually always had this idea that there would be a continuum between physical assets, maybe the fractionalized ownership of physical assets, and then digital assets, whether those were authentication tokens, whether those were digital twins, or whether they were digital content that stood alone. And I think we, along with a lot of people, were surprised in the beginning of 2021 on how quickly the NFT market took off. And at the time, I was pretty vocal, along with some of our founding board members, about the fact that it was super exciting and obviously opening up the world to this idea of digital asset ownership was thrilling. So much of that activity was just driven by speculation. And at the end of the day, what was really important was creating assets that served a purpose for fans and consumers that extended beyond just number go up. Yeah. And what we've seen as the market has now dramatically reset itself, speculation will always be a component of this market, like any sort of asset market. But there's a lot more focus on user experience. There's a lot more focus on user value. There's a lot more focus on that charged word utility. And we think those are all good things.
Yeah, it's interesting too. For people who have been around this space for a while, it wasn't just that explosion. It was like a few years ago, you mentioned like CryptoKitties. When they came out, there was a lot of derision about CryptoKitties. It's like the people thought it was ridiculous, but it was the first time that the NFT idea was popularized, and it showed that you had this digital ownership of a digital piece of art. And so from that sort of derision and people snickering at it to like just about 2 years later, people coming out and selling something for $60 million. It was a bit of a whiplash for folks like me who had been paying attention to that. So I wanted to go back a little bit and talk about your background. You mentioned that you first, before you got into finance, you were more of an artist and a designer. You got a degree in architecture from MIT. Were you an arty kid? Was that sort of the direction that you felt like you were going? Or was that something that just came easily to you when you were younger?
Yeah, I was always really interested in the arts. I was like a skateboard punk rock kid when I was in middle school and high school in Wisconsin. So in Midwest. And I used to draw on my Converse high tops and notebooks, and was always interested in artwork and art, history of art and design. But I also had a analytical side to me, math and science, etc. So I actually went to MIT to be a nuclear physicist. So slightly different direction, but go ahead.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, you might want to set your sights a little higher. I don't know.
This is a topic for a whole nother podcast, right? When you get down into the depths of quantum mechanics, art and science actually start to come together, right? Art, science, and religion all end up mixing together when you're talking about the fundamental matter of the universe. In my own brain, I saw a lot of connections between those things. But ultimately, being a physics PhD student, living in a sub-basement, smashing invisible particles together, intellectually interesting wasn't necessarily how I saw my life going forward. And the idea
not a great way to get chicks either.
Yeah, there was that too. But the idea of engineering that combined philosophy, art, design, structural engineering, etc., to create structures that change the way people live, like all that stuff clicked. And so that's how I ended up on the architecture track.
Were your parents in the arts, or was that like an influence on you?
Not at all. But my parents certainly appreciated arts, but that wasn't their thing. My dad was a huge sports fan. Sadly, he was a lifelong Cubs fan. That was a pretty tough fan to be. He grew up in a Chicago Bears fan, and my mom did a lot in the nonprofit space. The art stuff, I don't know where that spark came from.
Did your dad see the Cubs win the series?
He sadly passed away the year before they won. And we just said that it took him going to a higher place to finally get him to win the series.
Yeah, he was smiling down on them, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, so you're like a skateboard punk. You're probably listening to punk rock. But then it also sounds like the Midwest is known for practicality. So you're, okay, I can channel this love of art and drawing into something that's a little more structural, like architecture. But then was there even what was the change from the architecture path to finance? Because we'll get into this in a minute, but my God, you were at Goldman Sachs, you were at Fortress, you were at Moore Capital. These are heavy hitters. If listeners don't know, of course they know about Goldman, but Fortress and Moore Capital are a little bit more behind the scenes. But if in Wall Street, those are power hitters. Just tell me what happened to the architecture.
Yeah, it was pretty simple in a lot of ways. I had a pretty humble background. I paid my own way through college. I worked 5 or 6 jobs and graduated with a ton of student debt. I worked as an architect while I was still in school and spending my summers and part of the year during the school year working in an architecture firm. You know, you look around and you see the guy or the girl in the corner office. And, you know, my question is, okay, what do I have to do to become that person? And, you know, what I realized was I was a reasonably talented designer, but I didn't know anything about running a business. And that wasn't what my focus had been. And at the end of the day, architecture, most other disciplines that are non-academic are businesses. And so I said, okay, I need to learn about business, and how do I do that in a really focused way? And I had some fraternity brothers who had interned on Wall Street and graduated and worked on Wall Street. Felt to me that was a good opportunity to go live in New York City, work as a Wall Street analyst for a couple of years, learn about business and the crucible of capitalism, if you will, and make some money and pay down some student loans. And so my intention had been to go work for a couple of years and then go back and get my master's. And the story turned out a little differently, because when I landed there, I really found that environment, the dynamism, the competitive nature of working in global markets, just super thrilling, and still waiting to go back and get my master's in architecture one of these years.
Yeah, there's time. Yeah, my wife was a landscape architect, and it's like you said, it's tough unless you've got the name on the wall, basically, if you're George Hargraves or you're somebody like that, to really pay the bills. Let's get into just like because as listeners know, I love people who come from finance and then jump into Web3. And you were at Goldman Sachs. Is that sort of where you started? Did you come out of the internship there? And eventually you were in the fixed income, currency and commodities group, which is a powerhouse at the bank. They make a shit ton of money for people who don't know. What was that like? And was that sort of alluding to what you were just saying when you got the competitiveness of it and the fast pace and just the sort of, because it is a rush for sure.
Yeah, I think for me, my Wall Street career has always been a little unusual, or maybe my whole career has been a little unusual. And part of that is being someone who's interested in the arts and ends up on Wall Street. And so I never saw myself on the traditional path of, hey, my dream in life is to be a investment banker or be a commodities trader. I started out in a business that had one foot in both worlds, a group called Debt Capital Markets. And so I sat on a trading floor and was part of that energy of the global markets, but I worked directly with companies, with CFOs and things like that. A big part of that job was helping solve problems. And so I equated it to being an architect. When you're an architect, you have constraints. It might be the plot of land, the the budget, the building materials, et cetera, and you've got to use those constraints to create something that meets your client's needs. Financial services is the same thing in a lot of ways. You're solving financial problems for individuals or companies. Your constraints are just different. Their capital, their risk, their securities laws, and things like that. And that was the mentality I brought to the business. And what that meant is I actually ended up creating a bunch of new financial products and being in the middle of market transitions from voice broking to electronic trading, and being one of the individuals that kind of helped to create some of the big electronic trading businesses like TradeWeb. Stranded cost securitization and catastrophic risk reinsurance in the capital markets. Those were, new financial products that I was involved in helping to create. And that was really what kept me interested and kept me going, was this idea of building new products, building new businesses within, the construct of a larger business.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I didn't know you had a link to TradeWeb, which I used to cover quite often for Bloomberg. And then your next stop was at Fortress, and it's a funny title you had because you went through the financial crisis there. So you were the chief operating officer of liquid markets, which in the financial crisis, that was the problem. There were no liquid markets.
Things were a lot less liquid then.
Yeah, everything froze. What was that like from the inside there at a huge investment manager like Fortress? And did you have a sense that it was coming? Was it like a surprise when it happened? Or did you be like, oh, I think I saw this coming a little bit here?
Listen, I wish I could say that I saw it coming. At the time, when in 2008, there were a number of things that were, warning bells going into the Lehman bankruptcy. But I think even before then, if I rewind, and what we would say is the 100-year storm in finance comes every 3 or 4 years. And whether it was the Latin American debt crisis, whether it was the Russian debt crisis and LTCM, whether it was the sort of flash crash, et cetera, there are these kind of discontinuous moments in markets that can have either a short-term effect that wash people out or can be much more structural. And so obviously there's a lot of documentation and history around what led up to the Lehman crisis. What I would say, being inside our business and the liquid markets business, was a big global macro business. My partner, Mike Novogratz, founded that fund, and I'd helped build and manage that business. We spent a lot of time getting ready for something like Lehman Brothers and adjusting your risk and thinking about your counterparties and preparing. But I don't think anybody, certainly whether it was on the banking side or in the hedge fund side, really believed that a major U.S. investment bank was going to go bankrupt. And so it certainly sent tons of shockwaves through the system and made our lives very challenging for a number of months, but leading up to and then certainly after.
Yeah. And I remember, after Lehman, there were a couple other banks right in line to go down with them. And that's, I think, when the Fed stepped in and started buying everything they could on the street. That was some scary times.
Yeah, it was hard to go home and talk to your wife or friends and really feel like the world was about to end when you saw what was happening and what potentially could happen, because the perspective of someone who wasn't in the business every day, just they didn't think about it the same way. And at the time, I happened to be on the executive committee of the MFA, the Managed Funds Association. And we were down in DC about a week after Lehman went bankrupt, meeting with Hank Paulson, who was the Treasury Secretary at the time. And I just will remember very distinctly Hank and the other folks in Treasury were very interested in what we were seeing in the markets, but also very interested in what our ideas were, because no one had the playbook. And that was maybe the scariest moment. Like there was no one who was going to come in and fix this. We all had to figure it out together.
Yeah. And the part that I probably know the best here is the over-the-counter derivatives market, which was linking all of these banks and you guys and on the buy side. And nobody had a clue about where the risk was, because there was no way, like at that time, these over-the-counter swaps contracts weren't managed in any way. So that was, I think, what really got a lot of people's attention was that, you let Lehman go, but if you let Goldman or Bank of America go down, that's going to drag down a bunch of other folks with it. And that's when I think people got really scared.
And it's interesting, right? Just fast forward, or rewind rather, to last year, or fast forward from then to last year, given what happened with Three Arrows Capital, given what happened with FTX,
Yeah.
Some of those same contagion issues hit the crypto markets full on. And regardless of what happens and what you would hope would be lessons learned, history does unfortunately repeat itself in certain ways.
It does. But I loved that the sort of decentralized part of the ecosystem didn't really get affected at all. I thought that
100%.
that was great.
It was a great case for where things should be going in DeFi.
Yeah, that's why I've been very happy to see this summer called On-Chain Summer, because I think we need a lot more of that. So you mentioned Mike Novogratz. I was going to ask about him because is it his brother or his son Matthew who's working with you at Candy?
His brother Matt is my co-founder at Candy.
Okay. And then, so knowing Mike, who was roommates in college with Joe Lubin, who's an Ethereum co-founder and old Wall Street guy, did you ever cross paths with Joe back in the day?
I didn't cross paths with Joe back in my Wall Street days. I knew of Joe when Mike and I were partners at Fortress. Mike actually was early in the crypto space, even when he was still at Fortress, and helped to seed one of the early funds in the space, Pantera. Dan Moorhead was someone that we knew well from the macro world. And through Mike's relationship with Joe and Dan's thesis around what role cryptocurrencies were going to play and what the future of blockchain was, those were some of the contributing factors. And Mike's one of the best macro thinkers and macro traders out there. And he very much saw the trend and believed in the future of internet money, decentralized ownership, and ultimately what the next phase of either the world of finance or the world of the internet was going to be.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. I obviously, you can't speak for him, but it sounds like he saw it more than just an asset class, a new asset class. He saw it as something more far-reaching than that.
Yeah, I think so. I think like any great macro trader, what you're trying to do is you're trying to look at trends across markets, across economies, across societies, and sort of see where things are going. Macro traders are always looking for some new investable asset, but they also, if it's something new, you have to understand what you think the future is. Why is Bitcoin worth what Bitcoin is worth? And what's the power in Satoshi's white paper? Why is it important? Not just because you now have a digital asset that you can invest in, but what does it actually mean for the future of finance? What is that going to mean for big institutional investors like a BlackRock or a Fidelity to get interested in the space, and then ultimately individuals? And so I think that narrative, right, at the end of the day, macro investors are storytellers, right? They're interpreting stories, they're telling stories, and they're making bets around those stories. And I think that's at the core of how traders like Mike get excited about something new.
Yeah, very cool. It also made me smile when I saw that you were a senior advisor to Elephant, because it was a bond trading platform created by a guy named Cactus Razzie, who I know, and I wrote some profiles of him over the years. So just a really fascinating guy. And then it clicked when you said TradeWeb. So did you get to know Cactus through TradeWeb?
Yeah. So full disclosure, Cactus is one of my best friends. Okay. We go way back, worked together at Goldman, and as he was coming out of TradeWeb and setting up Elephant, spent a lot of time with him thinking through what that odd lot business looked like and what a platform like that could look like as well. And so incredibly talented individual, and super happy to have been on the journey with him as well.
Yeah. He's a fascinating guy, and he's probably got the best name in finance that I've ever heard, Cactus Razzie. I mean, I'm going to see him on Saturday, so tell him you said hi. Yeah, please do. We're getting closer to when you jump into Web3. So you started a kind of an investment and advisory firm called Parametric in early January 2017, and you started looking at blockchain projects, among other things. Was that like your first foray into this, or was there a moment where you just decided that I'm going to go into this full time now? Was there an event or a project or something that sort of pulled you in? Yeah, I had actually gotten involved a bit earlier than that, back in sort of 2013, 2014. A couple of other folks, as I mentioned, Mike Novogratz had started to invest while he was at Fortress, and then ultimately left to form Galaxy Digital. Some of my former MIT colleagues had been experimenting in the space,
particularly around Bitcoin, had run some experiments up at MIT where they had given incoming freshmen $100 worth of Bitcoin just to see what they would do with it. Would they buy a pizza? Would they immediately sell it? Would they hold on to it, et cetera? And so, I unfortunately, much to my chagrin, didn't do as much research at the time as I probably should have, but it was always in my head around what was this going to mean for finance? What was this going to mean for transaction processing? There were some interesting businesses from former Wall Street folks that were getting set up to explore what does it mean to put transactions on chain in the back office? What does it mean to put a major market exchange on chain? And then in 2017, after I retired from Moore, I really started to narrow my focus, having seen the kind of the run up, the 2016, 2017 run up, and then obviously the subsequent winter. It felt like that was a reset and an opportunity to get back involved and help to either participate in or potentially be involved in what the next phase of the space was going to be. And I didn't end up doing that full time. I was still involved in private investments, both as an investor and advisor, but then ultimately led to 2020 starting Candy Digital.
And was it like your kind of art interest from your whole life that the NFT area was where you wanted to go? And is that sort of what directed you to that part? Because there's a lot of different places in crypto to go. But
yeah, I think it's what got me the most excited, because having been a 27 year finance guy, like I felt like I'd done enough in that space. And even though the technology was super interesting and compelling, there were a lot of people in DeFi. There were a lot of people looking at TradFi opportunities and how to bring them on chain. And so I was interested in NFTs because they brought the finance, the tech, and the art together. And so that felt like something that I was interested in diving in on and seeing what the business opportunity was there.
And so take me through that, because obviously there must have been a wild ride at the beginning. There was so much buzz and lots of speculation and froth in the market. You had huge brands coming in, like we've mentioned, like Major League Baseball and NASCAR, the WWE. And then things have obviously, the market's reset. Like you said, we're in another pretty bad crypto winter right now. What have you, like, how do you talk about that cycle and where you think things are headed now?
Yeah, this was a totally crazy time. When we set the business up, the first place we looked at art, we looked at music, things that I'm personally passionate about, as well as sports and entertainment. But looking at those and realizing that it was harder to scale those communities and harder to potentially build a platform business. And so really thinking about where did those communities exist at scale, sports fans, entertainment fans, movies, shows, etc. And so that's where we decided to start the business. When we set it up as a joint venture between Galaxy Digital and Fanatics. If we're going to start a business in sports, Fanatics is one of the largest players out there, obviously on the e-commerce side. And so that's how we kicked the business off. And that was, really beneficial to Candy in terms of, getting those introductions to the leagues, having those conversations. And in the beginning of 2021, I like to say, unless you were in the crypto space, nobody really knew how to spell NFT, right? It just wasn't something that was on people's agenda or part of the conversation. And so we spent a lot of time in the beginning of the year educating the leagues and teams and athletes in a lot of instances, like what blockchain was, what cryptocurrencies were, what NFTs were, why they were interesting, what we saw the opportunity was, not just to sell a digital product, but really engage with fans in a new way. And whether that's through a collectible, whether it's through a digital ticket, whether it's through on-chain loyalty. And so I think we did a pretty good job getting out there and establishing ourselves as the institutional grade partner for a lot of these brands who were interested in the space. But as there was a ton of froth, a ton of folks who showed up and put an NFT hat on and said, hey, I'm in business now. And there was a lot of crap that got pushed into the marketplace. A lot of brands and athletes regret not doing their diligence, just jumping in, maybe not exactly with the right products or the right partners. And what we said at the time was, despite all the crazy activity, 98% of the NFTs were being minted probably weren't going to be worth anything in a few years' time, but that ultimately the underlying tech, the relationship with the customer, the communities that are developed are the things that are going to be longstanding and really power through the next phase. And so that's always been our thesis. And whether we were smart or lucky, who knows? We managed our business in a way where we didn't make huge commitments to partners that have unfortunately put a number of other players out of business. And we've always had a long-term view of what this opportunity is. Our long-term view hasn't changed. It's certainly a more challenging environment to operate in, but we're really fortunate to have great partners like Major League Baseball, great partners like NASCAR, Getty Images. With our recent Palm merger now, we bring Warner Brothers and DC Comics on board as well. And we feel pretty good about where we're at.
I can understand. I think the baseball card analogy is really helpful here, right? Because I would imagine Major League Baseball it was probably not that hard to sell them on this idea because it's a digital version of that's backed by a blockchain. And I understand that, but I'm curious, one thing that I don't quite understand, and I'm hoping you could help me, is if I'm like, I noticed some of the things you're selling on your platform are like moments in baseball history, like a walk-off home run or other things like great plays. And you can have a video clip that's your NFT, and then obviously it's secured by the Palm network and the blockchain. But does it complicate things when there's that video of something? Because what if I had that on VHS? And I know this might be a stupid analogy, and I apologize if it is, but I understand more like when it's a digital artwork. But when there's something in the middle of it that like somebody else's TV broadcast that's owned by ABC, let's say, or whatever, CBS, does that complicate things? Or how do you think about that sort of aspect of the sports memorabilia that you guys are digitizing at Candy?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, right? The way that we think about it is, you just go back to the baseball card idea, right? The traditional piece of cardboard is trading card 1.0, right? It has some imagery on the front, it has some stats or some text on the back. There's a obviously multi-billion-dollar market around the scarcity and rarity of those trading cards and huge conventions and swap meets and auctions and things like that. When we think about trading card 2.0, that's the digital picture of that, right? It's the digital representation of that physical asset. Could be a authentication of it, could be a digital twin, but it has the same type of information. What we create, or what we really are working to continue to create, is what we think of as trading card 3.0. So it's the same idea of a collectible asset that represents a player or a team, but isn't just a static image, brings video into it, brings motion graphics, brings sound, and brings dynamic statistics. And as that player plays, his game statistics update in real time. As someone collects those assets, the assets themselves can change, their collection can change. And so it adds a different level of sort of engagement, not just from the multimedia aspect, but also because you can layer data on top of it, and it can change over time. When you think about something that's like a standalone moment, I guess the analogy I would use, yes, of course, if it's a clip of Cal Ripken getting a historic home run, you can go to the internet and you can download that clip and save it on your computer. That clip that we sell is a unique and limited edition clip that's been authenticated by Major League Baseball. And so it is an asset that is ownable and tradable and has provenance and a history that is ultimately on chain. And so over time, if that particular moment, ownership of that moment becomes more important and more valuable, either emotionally or economically, that VHS clip, that's just a piece of content, having that digital asset that is connected to a token on chain confers that ownership. And so anyone can go to the internet and download a picture of the Mona Lisa, put it on their computer, but you're not going to sell that picture of the Mona Lisa. There's only one Mona Lisa. And there are a lot of kind of real world analogies that transfer over into digital, where facsimiles, copies, photographs, AI generated items. We're continue to have that debate. The magic of NFTs and tokenization is that it's unique and verifiable because it's associated with that blockchain based asset.
Yeah, and the provenance, I think, part makes sense to me, where Major League Baseball is sanctioning this, right? It's so that gives it a little bit more weight, maybe.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why we really focus on working with licensed partners, because we know that authenticity is important, right?
Mm-hmm.
Collectors and fans care about something that's authentic. There's tons of content, great content out there that get generated that isn't officially licensed or authenticated, but real collectors want to know that this is official and that Major League Baseball or Netflix or DC Comics puts its weight behind it.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned Dan Moorhead, Pantera. I was just reading their blockchain letter this morning, and they had a little section on esports, and they were making the same sort of analogy, the same point we're making, where a Michael Jordan jersey, you can buy one of those for $100. A Michael Jordan jersey that he wore in the finals in the NBA just sold for something like $10.8 million, right? Because there's like the rarity of that and the authenticity of that makes it so much more valuable. And their point was that in the kind of metaverse world, like skins and things like that, players might start wearing, it's the same sort of thing. And so it put me in mind, I knew I was going to be talking to you, and I wondered are you guys looking at that as well, like at skins and at things that are like digital wearables for like sports? And does that fit into the memorabilia part, or is that do you see that as a separate category from what you guys are doing at Candy?
Yeah, no, we're definitely interested in it. We've done a couple of projects with digital apparel and digital wearables. Since earlier this year, we released our Candy jerseys with Major League Baseball. And these are 3D asset jerseys for each of the teams. Ultimately, we do see as I say, one of the interesting things about the technology is, let's say that you end up with a Mike Trout digital jersey, and ultimately, because it's a digital asset, it's a 3D asset, right? You can look at it in an AR viewer, and so you can actually see it in real space. That asset might be something that can be ultimately be composable with an avatar, whether that's in the Candy ecosystem or in some game. And because it's tied back to the data infrastructure, Mike Trout plays a game and slides into home, that jersey might get dirty, right? It might change to actually reflect Mike's performance on the field. And so those are all different ideas that we're thinking about. We have done, and that was a jersey that we created with Major League Baseball. The other version of that is one of the projects we did with Netflix, where we actually went to the Stranger Things set rather, and digitally scanned the props from the show. The roller skates, Eleven's dress, the nail-studded bat, things that if you're a fan of Stranger Things, these are important icons that are part of the Stranger Things pantheon. And the level of detail that you can capture in that 3D scan, you can't get any closer other than holding the real thing. And so we sold those as digital assets, and those are real digital objects that are unique and rare and limited. And so today you can see it on your computer, you can see it on your phone, you can see it in an AR viewer. In the future, as technology evolves, you may be able to use that in a metaverse, or you frankly may be able to display that holographically on your shelf. So we try to think about where ultimately this tech is going, and AR and VR we're really excited about. We live in the here and now, and so we try to future-proof what we do and make it interesting and compelling as we can today.
Yeah, that's really cool. But yeah, and it always hasn't been easy. You guys, there was a divestment. Fanatics left as the market turned down. You had some layoffs, and it's a tough crypto winter right now. We at Decential are feeling that ourselves. We're trying to keep our money conservative and trying to make it through to the other side. Where do you think we are on that cycle? You've been through a couple of, or at least one winter here, and do you see something that might bring the market out of the doldrums? I think DeFi summer back in 2020 kind of pulled things out of the winter that started in 2018. And then the NFT stuff definitely helped as well. Do you think we're going to get pulled out by something like that, where there's a new application for blockchain, or what do you see as maybe the turning point?
Yeah, I think one of the things that would be the most helpful is just more regulatory certainty. aside from just the collapse in asset prices and lack of activity, we actually see a lot of interest and increased interest from brands who dipped their toe in the water or maybe jumped in 21 and 22, but now are taking a step back and saying, okay, this isn't just a way for us to try to sell something and make money or look cool because we have an NFT strategy, but we understand the technology is not going away. The market may be depressed, but what does it actually mean for the future of our customer relationship as more and more things become digital? And so that, from our perspective, is really encouraging. Now, in order to get there, those brands have to rethink their expectations around what it means to enter the space. The revenue model around how those businesses or those products get built need to, change and evolve. And it becomes less about selling a digital item for $1 million and more about how do we engage with our fans and our consumers in a way where we're collecting zero-party data and establishing a digital relationship in one that doesn't exist today through advertising or through our social connections. And so that part's really encouraging. I think one of the things that is just an overhang on the whole industry is this regulatory uncertainty, right? The United States and the SEC has not done any of us any favors in terms of helping to put that path forward. And so that has certainly kept some large brands and some large players from being more aggressive in the space. So there isn't one thing in particular that we're looking at and saying, if that switch gets flipped, we're off to the races again. I don't think that's necessarily what the next phase is going to be. But what I do think is we're actually not that far into this sort of latest winter. There are a number of folks who have exited the business. There's less noise. That's a good thing. And there are a smaller number of folks who are continuing to build for the long term. And I think as long as we keep building and stay focused on what we're all trying to solve, which is ease of use, lack of fraud, safety and security, regulatory and legal clarity and certainty, and ultimately composability and a compelling use case for consumers, like we'll get there. It might turn on a dime again like it did in 21, or it might just be a slow build.
Yeah, I'm talking to folks every week here who are moving their businesses offshore or not offering services to the U.S. because of that regulatory uncertainty. So it is definitely happening. And I agree with you. I think it's a shame. And then I think on the NFT side, I think brands have figured out that it's much smarter to give away NFTs and then create experiences for either the consumer or the fan that holds that NFT. So you might get special access at a concert or at an auditorium or a stadium for a game, or you get a special access to a new line of clothing or something. So I think that's something we've been covering here. And I feel like that's been evolving almost before our eyes. And I think that's really interesting, especially in the music space, where I think musicians are figuring out that this is a really great way to go directly to their fans and not need the record company. And I think there's a huge battle going on there because the record companies have always had so much control over that sort of the part of the business, and there's so much money at stake. So that's something that I'm watching really closely. Okay, just one last thing real quick. I saw that you were involved with the skate park project, and now I know that you're a former skate punk. Does that have anything to do with Jeff Ament at Pearl Jam? He's the bass player, and he's been building skate parks around the country.
I think he has done some work with Tony and the skate park project. This is really the Tony Hawk Foundation, and one of Tony's efforts to help individuals, kids, communities to build skate parks and change the narrative, right, around what skateboarding is for a lot of folks.
Do you remember the stickers when we were kids? It was skateboarding is not a crime.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was next to the skate and destroy sticker.
Yeah.
And I was involved a little bit more directly a number of years ago, a little less so since I'm building a startup company, but still really passionate about the mission.
Okay. Just wanted to check in on that because I love Pearl Jam. I think what he's doing is great. Scott, thank you so much for all your time and sharing your background and your history with me. Let folks know how they can learn more about Candy Digital and about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Candy.com is where it's all at. You can check out all of our various partners. As we mentioned earlier, we recently merged with Palm NFT Studio. We're going to be bringing Palm relationships over to Candy as well relatively shortly. And then follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and certainly sign up for our Discord. Love to see you.
Yeah. Is there any project coming up that you're particularly excited about?
We're really knee deep in the current MLB season. And so we've got a bunch of releases coming up around our core products leading up to the playoffs. And then with our partners at DC, getting ready to announce some of the next phases of the Bat Cowl project, which has been, a really successful project for folks who are helping not only to connect with the storyline, but also help create the storyline. So I'm really excited about both of those.
Yeah, that's cool. If you could please do anything you can to get the Dodgers to win another World Series, I would really appreciate it, because I'm not sure how many more seasons I can take where they get to the playoffs and then just don't do anything.
We'll do our best.
Excellent. All right. Scott, thanks again, man. It was really great talking to you, and best of luck with Candy Digital.
Likewise. Really appreciate it, Matt. Have a great day.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for joining us, and don't forget to rate and follow this show on Apple, Spotify, and Amazon Music. Decent People is a production of Decential Media. It is produced by Matt Bogart, with music by Brian Duncan and Kareem Imes.